March 15th, 1952, the Flamingo Club, Manhattan. Five of the most powerful crime bosses in America sat around a mahogany table, dividing up Harlem like pieces of a chessboard. Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and Albert Anastasia. Between them, they controlled every major crime operation from Boston to Baltimore, generating millions in illegal revenue every month. They were finalizing the biggest territorial grab in organized crime history when the door opened without a knock. A woman walked in, alone, unarmed, wearing a simple black dress and pearl necklace. She moved with quiet confidence, even though she was the last person anyone expected to see in this room filled with the most dangerous men in America. The room went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. This was a meeting that could start wars or end them, where fortunes were won and lost with a single word. And yet here stood a woman, calm as Sunday morning, studying each face with the precision of someone taking careful inventory. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like silk through steel, "I believe you've been discussing my husband's territory without my husband." That woman was Mayme Johnson, Bumpy's wife, and what she said in the next 10 minutes didn't just end the meeting. It made five crime bosses voluntarily surrender territory worth millions of dollars. Territory they'd spent months planning to steal, territory they'd already considered theirs. But how does a woman with no army, no weapons, no backup walk into a room full of the most dangerous men in America and make them back down? The answer reveals something about power that most people never understand. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't violence, it's truth delivered by someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. To understand what happened that night at the Flamingo Club, you need to understand the chain of events that led five crime families to believe they could simply take Harlem. February 3rd, 1952. Bumpy Johnson was arrested on federal conspiracy charges at 6:23 a.m. outside his apartment on 35th Street. The FBI had been building their case for 3 years, using wiretaps, informants, and financial records. As Bumpy was led away in handcuffs, photographers captured the moment for newspapers across the city. The message was clear: the king of Harlem had fallen. Every crime family from New York to Chicago saw the same opportunity. Harlem was leaderless, and leaderless territory was free territory. The numbers racket alone generated over $50,000 weekly. The policy banks, protection money, legitimate fronts. It was an empire worth fighting for. But they made a crucial mistake that would cost them everything. They assumed that Bumpy Johnson was a one-man operation, that removing him would collapse his entire network like a house of cards. They didn't understand that for 15 years, Mayme Johnson had been the invisible foundation holding everything together, the strategic mind behind the operation. While other crime families relied on fear and violence to maintain control, Mayme had built something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous: complete information. Dominance over every criminal operation in the city. Frank Costello called the meeting for March 15th. With Bumpy gone, Harlem's numbers racket is wide open, he told the other bosses during a preliminary gathering at Rao's restaurant 2 weeks earlier. We move fast. We move together. We carve it up clean. No wars, no bloodshed, just business as usual. The plan was deceptively simple. Divide Harlem into 5 distinct territories, each family taking responsibility for their designated section. They had 40 seasoned soldiers ready to move in, 3 federal judges on their payroll to handle any legal complications, and enough money to buy off any cops who might get curious about the sudden change in neighborhood management. What they didn't have was permission from the one person who actually controlled every significant criminal operation in Harlem, the woman they'd never considered a threat. Mayme Johnson wasn't just Bumpy's wife. She was his partner, his strategic advisor, and most importantly, his carefully chosen successor. While Bumpy handled the public face of their operations, the street negotiations, the territorial disputes, the visible displays of power that kept enemies at bay, Mayme managed the intricate infrastructure that made it all possible. She had spent a full decade building something unprecedented in organized crime history. A civilian intelligence network that monitored, documented, and analyzed every major criminal operation in New York City. It was a system so sophisticated that even the FBI would have envied its comprehensive reach and devastating effectiveness. The idea had come to her in 1942 during World War II, when Mayme noticed how ordinary citizens were being recruited by the government to watch for enemy spies and saboteurs. Grandmothers were reporting suspicious activities in their neighborhoods. Shopkeepers were documenting unusual purchases and strange customers. Cab drivers were noting passenger requests that seemed out of place. The federal government could turn everyday people into intelligence assets. Why couldn't she do the same thing for criminal surveillance? She began recruiting carefully and methodically. A newsstand operator who saw everyone coming and going from important buildings. A cleaning lady who worked in office buildings where businessmen held private meetings after hours. A cab driver who worked the night shift and overheard conversations passengers thought were completely private. People who were completely invisible to criminals, but who saw absolutely everything that mattered in the underworld. By 1950, Mayme had over 40 carefully selected civilians on her intelligence payroll, each one documenting specific aspects of New York's vast criminal ecosystem. They weren't criminals themselves. That was absolutely crucial to the system's success and legal protection. They were ordinary citizens who needed extra income and understood that information had real value in the right hands. When the five families began planning their Harlem takeover in earnest, Mayme's network had been tracking every meeting, every phone call, every private conversation for weeks. She knew about the territorial grab before they'd even chosen the Flamingo Club as their meeting location. March 14, 1952. Detective William Iron Bill McCarthy approached Mayme during what appeared to be a chance encounter at Minnie's kitchen on 14th Fifth Street. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, sliding into the booth across from her with the casual manner of an old friend. "Tomorrow night, 5 families are meeting at the Flamingo Club downtown. They're planning to carve up your husband's territory like a Thanksgiving turkey. Thought you should know." But Mayme had known about the meeting for 2 full weeks. Her intelligence network had been tracking every preliminary discussion, every strategic phone call, every quiet conversation in restaurants and social clubs across the city. She knew exactly who would attend, what they would discuss, how they planned to implement their territorial division, and most importantly, what documented evidence existed of their criminal conspiracy. Mayme could have responded the way everyone expected her to. She could have called Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, men like Illinois Gordon and Willie the Bishop Adams, prepared for all-out war, arranged for 40 battle-hardened soldiers to storm the Flamingo Club with guns blazing. That's what the 5 families were prepared for. That's what they understood and knew how to counter with their own superior firepower. Instead, Mayme Johnson decided to do something completely unprecedented in organized crime history. She would attend the meeting herself and demonstrate that real power didn't come from armies or weapons or threats of violence. It came from possessing information that your enemies didn't know you had and being willing to use it. March 15th, 8:47 p.m. The Flamingo Club had been closed to the public since 7 p.m. with only essential personnel remaining inside. The 5 bosses had been meeting in the private back room for over 2 hours, and the atmosphere was celebratory, almost festive. They'd already agreed on the basic territorial divisions that would completely reshape Harlem's criminal landscape forever. Costello would control the 125th to 135th Street. Luciano would manage 135th to 135th. The Gambino family would handle all eastern territories, and Anastasia would oversee the policy banks and numbers operations. They were celebrating with expensive whiskey and imported Cuban cigars, toasting their upcoming windfall when Mayme walked in without invitation, without announcement, without fear. Conversation stopped instantly. The celebratory atmosphere vanished like smoke. Costello's bodyguard, a man named Sal, the Fish Martino, instinctively reached for the gun concealed under his jacket. But Costello held up a single finger, a gesture that immediately froze every hand in the room. Something about the woman's complete absence of fear made everyone pause. In their world, people who weren't afraid were either very stupid or extremely dangerous. And Mayme Johnson clearly wasn't stupid. "Mrs. Johnson," Costello said slowly, rising from his chair with the careful, measured movements of a man trying not to provoke a dangerous animal. "This is unexpected and entirely inappropriate. This is a private business meeting between associates." Mayme smiled, but it wasn't friendly or warm. It was the kind of smile that made intelligent men suddenly nervous about decisions they'd thought were completely safe. "I know exactly what kind of meeting this is, Mr. Costello. You're discussing my family's property, without my family's consent or knowledge." Lucky Luciano laughed, but the sound was forced, nervous, lacking his usual confidence. "Lady, your husband is sitting in a federal prison cell facing 20 years. Your family's property belongs to whoever has the strength and organization to hold it, and that sure ain't you." Mayme walked deliberately to the center of the room, positioning herself directly between the 5 crime bosses and their 15 armed bodyguards. She was outnumbered by dangerous men carrying loaded weapons, but she moved like she was the most threatening person in the room, like she held all the cards in this deadly game. You think Bumpy's arrest changed something fundamental? She said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. You think Harlem is suddenly available for new management, ready to be carved up and distributed? You're wrong. Vito Genovese leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt and barely controlled anger.
Oh, really?
And who exactly is going to stop us from taking what we want? You? Me. Mayme confirmed without hesitation. And every single person in Harlem who remembers what respect means, who understands what loyalty looks like? That's when she opened her purse. Every gun in the room was trained on her within seconds. F-15 professional killers, all pointing weapons at one unarmed woman. The click of safeties being released echoed through the room like a symphony of death. But Mayme didn't pull out a weapon. She didn't even flinch at the arsenal pointed in her direction. She pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of all 5 bosses leaving the Flamingo Club from their previous planning meeting 2 weeks ago. The image was crystal clear, professionally lit, taken with expensive equipment by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Recognize this?" she asked calmly, holding up the photograph so everyone could see it clearly. It was taken by Mrs. Eleanor Washington, who runs the newsstand on the corner of 42nd and Broadway. She takes pictures of everyone who enters and leaves this building. Interesting hobby for a 70-year-old grandmother, don't you think? Frank Costello's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What's your point, Mrs. Johnson?" Mayme reached into her purse again, this time pulling out a thick manila envelope that appeared to be stuffed with documents and additional photographs. "These," she said, dumping the contents onto the mahogany table with a dramatic flourish, "are photographs of every single person who entered this building tonight. Your bodyguards, your drivers, your advisors, your associates, all photographed, all identified, all documented with precise timestamps and vehicle information. The photographs scattered across the polished table surface like fallen leaves. Clear, well-lit images of every person connected to the meeting, taken from multiple angles showing arrivals, departures, license plate numbers, and even captured conversations. But that's not the interesting part," Mayme continued, her voice getting quieter and somehow more dangerous with each word. "The interesting part is what Mrs. Washington does with these photographs every single day." She pulled out one final item, a pre-addressed mailing envelope. Clearly marked FBI Special Agent Thomas Wilson, Organized Crime Division, Federal Building, New York. "Every single photograph gets mailed to the FBI within 24 hours, Mayme explained matter-of-factly as if discussing the weather, along with detailed written reports about who met with whom, when they arrived, how long they stayed, what vehicles they used, and any suspicious activities observed. Mrs. Washington has been documenting organized crime meetings for 3 years now. The Federal Bureau of Investigation pays her very well for this invaluable information." The room was absolutely silent. 5 of the most powerful crime bosses in America stared at the photographs spread across the table, slowly understanding the full implications of what they were seeing. Meeting to divide territory was criminal conspiracy. Being photographed and documented while doing it was federal evidence that could result in 20-year prison sentences. "But here's what you really don't understand," Mayme said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper while somehow becoming more menacing. "Mrs. Washington isn't the only one. We have 12 people exactly like her positioned strategically throughout the city. Grandmothers, shopkeepers, janitors, cab drivers, newsstand operators, people you never notice. People you'd never suspect, people who are completely invisible to you. And they document everything." Lucky Luciano was the first to find his voice.
You're bluffing.
Mayme reached into her purse one final time. She pulled out a small leather-bound address book, opened it to a page marked with a red silk ribbon, and began to read aloud in a clear, steady voice. "Frank Costello," she said clearly. "March 1st, 2:30 p.m., Rouse Restaurant on East 1114th Street. Private meeting with Judge Harold Mitchell about fixing bail hearings for organized crime defendants. Photographed, documented, and reported to federal authorities." Costello's face went pale beneath his expensive tan. Lucky Luciano, March 3rd, 11 a.m., Pier 47 on the Hudson River, personally receiving heroin shipment from Sicily, including direct bribery of customs official Vincent D'Angelo worth $15,000. Photographed, documented, and reported. Luciano's hand-rolled Cuban cigar fell from his mouth and scattered burning ash across his expensive suit.
Vino Genovese.
March 8th, 6:00 p.m. Your nephew's wedding reception at the Plaza Hotel, private discussion with Chicago crime family representatives about territorial expansion into East Coast markets. Photographed, documented, and reported. She continued methodically through the address book, reading specific dates, precise times, exact locations, and detailed activities for all 5 crime bosses, information that could only have come from sustained professional surveillance by people with access to places where criminals felt completely safe and unobserved. You see, gentlemen, Mayme said, closing the address book with a soft snap that sounded like a coffin lid closing in the profound silence. You think power comes from guns and money and the fear you can instill in other people? But real power, lasting, unbreakable power, comes from information. And in Harlem, I control every piece of information that matters. The 5 crime bosses exchanged nervous glances. They were beginning to realize that they weren't just discussing business with Bumpy Johnson's wife. They were attempting to negotiate with the head of the most sophisticated criminal intelligence network in New York City, possibly in the entire United States. What do you want? Carlo Gambino asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the room's tense breathing. I want you to leave, Mayme said with deadly simplicity. I want you to walk out of this club, get in your cars, drive back to your own territories, and never discuss Harlem again. Because if you don't, if you proceed with this territorial grab, tomorrow morning the FBI receives enough documented evidence to indict all 5 of you for federal conspiracy, racketeering, tax evasion, and interstate transportation of stolen goods. And if we do leave? Albert Anastasia asked carefully. Mayme smiled, and for the first time that evening it seemed genuinely warm. Then Mrs. Washington develops a sudden passionate interest in photographing birds instead of buildings. The grandmother who's been documenting your private dinner meetings discovers a new hobby in knitting. The janitor who's been recording your conversations finds that he prefers listening to music instead of eavesdropping on criminal conspiracies. The offer was crystal clear: respect Harlem's independence and leave the territory alone, and the intelligence network would focus its attention elsewhere. Try to take what wasn't rightfully theirs, and 5 crime empires would be systematically exposed to federal prosecution. Frank Costello was the first to stand, his chair scraping against the floor in the profound silence. This meeting is over, he announced firmly. Frank, Lucky Luciano protested desperately. We can't let one woman, Costello interrupted, his voice cutting through Luciano's objection like a blade. Just demonstrated that she possesses enough documented evidence to put all 5 of us in federal prison for the rest of our natural lives. This isn't about what one woman can or can't do. This is about what one organization can accomplish. And Mrs. Johnson's organization just proved beyond any doubt that it's more dangerous than all of our organizations combined. One by one, the 5 most powerful crime bosses in America stood up and walked out of the Flamingo Club. No handshakes, no goodbyes, no promises or threats, just the quiet, grudging acknowledgement that they had been completely and thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone they had fatally underestimated. The last to leave was Vito Genovese. At the door, he turned back to face Mayme one final time. This isn't over, he said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of future retribution. Mayme looked at him with exactly the same calm, confident expression she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Yes, it is, she replied with absolute certainty. Because tomorrow morning you're gonna wake up and realize that fighting me means fighting every grandmother, every shopkeeper, every ordinary person you walk past on the street. You can't win a war against an entire neighborhood, Mr. Genovese, and Harlem is my neighborhood. Vito Genovese left without saying another word. Mayme Johnson stood alone in the Flamingo Club for 10 full minutes, making absolutely certain that all 5 crime bosses and their entourages had actually departed and weren't planning some kind of ambush or retaliation. Then she walked calmly to the bar, poured herself a glass of the club's finest bourbon, and raised it in a silent toast to her imprisoned husband. The next morning, March 16th, 1952, word spread through organized crime circles across the entire eastern seaboard. Harlem was permanently off limits to outside interference. Not because it was too well defended militarily, but because it was too well documented legally. The five most powerful crime families in America quietly abandoned their territorial expansion plans and refocused their attention on other, less dangerous opportunities. But the real genius of Mayme's strategy became apparent in the weeks that followed. Within 7 days, three separate crime families from Philadelphia, Boston, and Detroit had quietly reached out to Mayme Johnson through carefully chosen intermediaries. They weren't contacting her to threaten or intimidate. They wanted to hire her services. Could her intelligence network document their enemies' illegal activities? Could she provide photographic evidence of their rivals' criminal conspiracies? Could her organization gather the kind of information that would allow them to eliminate competition without resorting to violence and the heat that came with it? Mayme Johnson had accidentally invented an entirely new form of organized crime, information brokerage and intelligence warfare. Instead of selling drugs or running illegal gambling operations, she sold surveillance, documentation, and strategic intelligence. It was infinitely safer than traditional criminal activities, significantly more profitable than most illegal enterprises, and completely legal as long as the information was gathered by private citizens in public places. By 1954, when Bumpy Johnson was finally released from federal prison after serving 2 years, Mayme had built and operated the most sophisticated criminal intelligence operation on the East Coast. She maintained active contacts in 12 major cities, operated surveillance networks in 6 different states, and possessed enough documented evidence of criminal activities to influence organized crime politics from Canada to Cuba. Bumpy's return to Harlem wasn't simply the restoration of a crime boss to his former territory. It was the reunion of the most powerful and innovative crime partnership in American criminal history. Bumpy handled public strategy, territorial negotiations, and community relations. Mayme controlled intelligence gathering, information warfare, and strategic documentation. Together, they didn't just protect Harlem from outside interference and criminal exploitation. They transformed their neighborhood into the intelligence capital of organized crime, where information was more valuable than heroin and knowledge was deadlier than bullets. The 5 crime bosses never again attempted to meet collectively to discuss territorial expansion into Harlem. Frank Costello retired from active crime management in 1957, officially citing health concerns. Lucky Luciano relocated his operations permanently to Italy in 1955. Vito Genovese tried the longest to challenge and undermine Mayme's intelligence network. But in 1959, he was arrested on federal conspiracy charges based on evidence that included photographs, recorded conversations, and documented meetings spanning 7 years. He died in federal prison in 1969. The night at the Flamingo Club became absolute legend in organized crime circles throughout the country. Young criminals heard the story and learned 2 crucial lessons. First, never underestimate any person based on their gender, age, or apparent powerlessness. Second, in the modern world of criminal enterprise, information and intelligence were infinitely more dangerous than traditional weapons and ammunition. Mayme Johnson had proven something that fundamentally changed organized crime forever. The most devastating weapon isn't necessarily the one that physically destroys your enemies. It's the weapon that forces your enemies to destroy themselves through their own documented criminal behavior. She walked into a room full of professional killers and made them leave voluntarily. She faced down 5 criminal empires with nothing but photographs, addresses, and documented evidence. She protected an entire neighborhood without firing a single shot, without throwing a single punch, without even raising her voice above a conversational tone. But most importantly, Mayme Johnson demonstrated an eternal truth about real power. It doesn't come from what you can physically do to other people. It comes from what people know you can do to them, what they believe you're capable of accomplishing, and what they understand you're always prepared to reveal about their secret activities. And when everyone knows you're always watching, always documenting, always staying 3 strategic steps ahead of their plans, you don't need an army of soldiers or an arsenal of weapons. You just need the truth and the absolute courage to use it.